Hi guys. So I'm throwing down the gauntlet. 12-step programs aren't good. And I'm going to go into exactly why. Now this is going to be a long video, but if you hang in there, I'll be talking about a new meeting format that I'd like to try at the end. Now, like any mental health video, I'll be talking about topics like self-harm and, stuff like that. So consider this your warning. But honestly, the channel's called Ask a Science Fiction Writer. If you don't see the trigger warning inherent to the name, you're in the wrong place. So I recently had a conversation with another AA person that's exactly the same as hundreds of conversations I've had before. It goes something like this. I'd like to start a secular, science-based meeting. Well, you need Jesus. That's how those conversations go. I'm not kidding. And I'm getting pretty good at making sure that they can't use their, mental gymnastics about, you get to define your own higher power. It doesn't have to be God. But we'll get into that. Now, most of my problem with 12-step programs does have to do with their reliance on God. But if we're being completely honest, they're not that helpful to Christians either. But there are a lot of issues that come from this. So don't just dismiss this video by simply saying that you know that secular Alcoholics Anonymous is a thing. Yes, they are a thing, and they got a lot of these problems too. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about where 12-step programs come from, what they are exactly, how they work, and we'll even go through each of the 12 steps one by one. And I'm going to burn this mother to the ground. But have no fear, because I do come bearing solutions. Hopefully better, more modern solutions. I'm not a therapist or an addiction specialist. I do a lot of videos about mental health because I'm someone who's been through a lot of treatment, and I'm currently in recovery from alcohol. So I have a lot of real world experience here. That's what I'm talking from. So I am reasonably qualified to talk about these subjects. However, I'm not qualified to give medical advice. So if you are suffering from addiction or any kind of mental illness, these videos can help, but you need a professional. So let's dive in. This is everything wrong with 12-step programs that I thought of while I was writing the script for this video. Before we go any further, make sure to click like and subscribe. That way you'll get to see more content like this. Also, to help other people find this content. You can also join my Patreon. There'll be links down below. And a reminder at the end of the video. For now, enjoy the rest of the video. Alright, so the 12 steps, as everybody knows, they come from AA, Alcoholics Anonymous. I'll just be calling them AA. AA was invented in the 1930s by these two guys, Bill and Bob. They were both alcoholics, and they were commiserating with each other one day about how difficult their lives were because of the drinking. And before they knew it, it had blossomed into a meeting, the first meeting, with other people. And from this meeting came the first 12-step program, which led directly to the big book of AA getting written. So the 1930s, let's just look at that period in history for a moment. You have Hitler and Mussolini rising up with fascism over in Europe, Stalin in his purges. In the U.S., we had a real solid eugenics movement. I like pointing out to people that a lot of the Nazi ideas came from the United States eugenics movement. That's a fun thing to point out. The Great Depression was in full swing, and Prohibition had just ended. And there was also a Red Scare, which accompanied, and like kind of in the background of all of this, there was a huge Christian awakening. Times of high stress, times of need. In the United States, there tends to be another round of Christian awakenings. People, moving around on, of course, in the 19th century, there were horses and buggies and stuff, but in the 30s, they would have been in cars and trucks, setting up tents and preaching and all that kind of stuff. So this is the environment in which AA was originally developed. Now, they chose to target alcoholism specifically, and they targeted it as an illness, stopping short of calling it a disease. Now, nowadays we recognize that illness and disease are synonyms. They're the same thing. So their cure was a spiritual awakening, and not just any kind of spiritual awakening, a Christ-centered awakening, which was really quite normal in the 30s. And so this is the foundation of the 12 steps. Later on, particularly during the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, they would try to shift away from Christ specifically. And that's when you start seeing all the discussion of you get to define your own higher power, whatever you have. And also it has grown to a huge organization with quite a few spin-offs. You've probably heard of Gambling Anonymous, Gamblers Anonymous, but probably the more important one is Narcotics Anonymous, because not that gambling addicts aren't important. Narcotics Anonymous kind of tried to modernize 12 steps. They formed in the 60s. And they were the first group to recognize that addiction is the same disease regardless of which drug you're using. And so they allow, your cokeheads and your meth heads and whoever into the group. AA, even to this day, still only allows alcoholics. Just on a side note, talking about science fiction, this is the reason why you see people going to NA. Like if you watched Heroes, and there was that one guy, was it Siler, who was trying not to use his powers, and he was going to NA, and he couldn't tell people what he was addicted to because they wouldn't believe him, or they would kick him out of the group or whatever. Yeah, there's another one. Of course, in Finding Nemo, they had the sharks, fish are friends, not food. That was fun. Now, I don't know when this particular development happened. It could have been built in from the start, but nowadays 12-step programs ask you to turn your addiction over to a higher power without specifying that they mean the Christian God. Except we'll be looking at the 12 steps. You'll see what I mean. I'm going to get some hate over this. So let me point out that I have had a majority of people from AA specifically who have tried to explain this whole higher power thing to me, that if I don't end up with God, I'm doing something wrong. Whatever I define my higher power as, if it ends up not being God, I'm doing it wrong. A majority of people that I have talked to that went to AA, and I do understand this basic idea that you can define your higher power as whatever you want, but I'm a Satanist, and I'd like you to point me to a group that will be fine with me having Lucifer as a higher power. Now, I have had people tell me that would be fine as long as I don't go to their meeting. You see where this is going. So let's talk about the legacy of AA. It was the first modern group to show us that recovery was possible. And I can't underline this enough. Before AA, people just didn't think of alcoholism as an illness, and so they didn't think you could recover from it like you would any other illness. And a lot of times, the person who does something first isn't the person who does it best. But the importance of being first is that you show other people that something is possible. And so we do get that from AA. Thanks to them, we now know that recovery is possible. And they have had a lot of improvements over the years. I'm not going to deny that. Historically, recovery has always been possible. It just didn't happen very often because the culture being what it has been, and in many ways still is, we don't see drinking as a problem, and we tend to blame the person when they drink too much. Which is wrong, and I'll get into that, but you don't see it very often. We had at least one founding father, I don't remember who was famous for not drinking. Well, one of the things he was famous for. But this isn't something you really see very often until AA comes along and people start getting sober in huge numbers. Now, when Bill and Bob started out, they weren't looking to start a large international organization. They just wanted to live without drinking and ruining their lives and hurting their loved ones. But in order to do that, they had to figure out how to make recovery happen. And once they did that, they shared it with other people. It's reasonable to say without AA that the modern recovery community wouldn't exist at all. It's also reasonable to think that without AA, the medical community wouldn't have paid attention to addicts until much more recently, and we wouldn't be as far as we are with addiction treatment. I'm saying that regardless of the criticisms I'm about to throw out, and I'm going to throw a lot of them out. We do all owe a serious debt to AA and what they've accomplished. I just don't want to give off the impression that I'm not grateful to AA. It has affected my life personally. I mean, honestly, without AA, I wouldn't be making this video right now. So all that said, AA is nearly a century old, and we have learned a lot more about addiction since then. So I think it's time to seriously revisit the 12 steps and consider whether or not they should be revised or possibly discarded completely. So let's start by taking a look at the 12 steps as they were originally written. I don't believe they've been significantly modernized. I got this off of Wikipedia. I didn't go to the AA website for this. Step 1. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol and that our lives had become unmanageable. Now, you would think this is obvious and common, but the thing is, it's not universal. There are a lot of people who drink too much and are alcoholics that stop at the first step because of that word unmanageable. The concept of a functional alcoholic is a real thing. Before I went to rehab, you could say I was a functional alcoholic because I paid my bills, I took care of business, I took care of the people I loved. I happened to do it all while I was drunk, but you see, in fact, until I went to rehab, I didn't really understand that I was an alcoholic in need of treatment. It took talking to other people, talking to therapists for me to really understand that. So there are a lot of people out there, just like me, who will stop at the first step because they can still manage their lives. So there's this idea that you have to spiral until you're, passing out in the gutter 3 nights a week, and you can't have stable friendships or whatever. You have to have done all of that before you can say you're an alcoholic. That's just not true. But the first step is realizing you have a problem. So there we go. Step 2. came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Now, if there's anything science has learned over the years, sanity and insanity aren't real things. Yes, there is a legal definition for insanity, and it only applies if you're accused of a crime. Now, my biggest issue with this step is that you're dumping the problem on something else. AA is big on accountability, and I've said it in other videos. Treatment starts with accountability. There is no treatment without accountability. How accountable can you be if you're expecting a power greater than yourself to come along and fix you? I would like to point out that this step deliberately does not identify that power greater than ourselves. Wait for it. Step 3, made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God. That's it. That's the power. That's the higher power. God appears in the 12 steps, I believe 4 times in total. That's a crap ton of times that a nebulous higher power that you get to define is given an actual name. And don't even try to tell me that the word is just used as a placeholder for your higher power. It's capitalized for a reason. It is the God of Abraham. There are also capitalized he's and hims elsewhere in the 12 steps. There is no ambiguity here. Now, as a Satanist, of course, I find the idea that I should turn my life over to the care of God to be patently offensive. I thought that when I was an atheist, and there are millions of people out there who agree with me. But when you ask someone who goes to AA, they'll tell you that you can do some mental gymnastics, find a way to define a higher power as anything other than God, and then you can go to the meetings. But here's the catch to that. One of the ways you become an alcoholic is by doing mental gymnastics in the first place. Ask your local alcoholic why they drink so much and listen to the excuses. I've made many of them myself. So if I do the mental gymnastics needed to define my own higher power so I can go to essentially a Christian meeting and get some benefit from it, I would actually be reinforcing the addiction. And this is not an agree to disagree situation. Neuroplasticity is the property where the brain changes over time, you carve out new neural pathways, and so on and so forth. And it's the mechanism through which treatment actually works. But if you reinforce the same neural pathways that led you to become an alcoholic in the first place, your treatment program doesn't work. Step 4. Made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. Now, this soul searching is an important part of treatment, but the use of the word moral here has some issues. For people who are not addicts, it reinforces the idea that you are an immoral person. You're a bad person because you drink too much, that good people don't do that sort of thing. And I've heard a lot of that crap. But here's the thing, acquiring a disease isn't a moral failure, whether it's cancer, diabetes, AIDS, multiple sclerosis, addiction. And one of the biggest hurdles for addicts in treatment is internalizing the idea that their addiction is not a moral failing, and that drinking or using is not a choice. And if addicts are having a hard time understanding this, then what hope do we have of ever being accepted by society? And here's AA reinforcing that moral failure narrative. All right, step 5, admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. Now, this is the second time the higher power is named with no mental gymnastics allowed. It also singles out the exact nature of our wrongs. And the way this usually works, people are just admitting that they're alcoholic. And there's nothing inherently wrong with being an alcoholic. The wrong things they're talking about here are usually things that we do because we're acting out or behaving ineffectively. Those are the fancy therapy words, by the way. I'm not saying that alcoholics don't hurt people or hurt themselves or act out or do crazy or reckless things. We do. We do it all the damn time. I'm just saying that within 10 years of the repeal of prohibition, simply drinking a lot would have been considered morally wrong rather than the very treatable medical condition we now know it to be. Now, all that said, the step is obviously about denial, and you can't even start recovery if you're still in denial. So the meaning is clear, and it's obviously very important. But the step does require you to admit it to God. You really only have to admit it to yourself and at least one other person. And that one other person is kind of optional too. All right, now steps 6 and 7 are basically the same thing. And there are 2 more mentions of God by name in them. Step 6 is, we were entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. Step 7 is, we humbly asked him to remove our shortcomings. Now, I have 2 problems with these steps. The first is obvious. We're asking a fictional entity to fix us. It's an abrogation of responsibility. It's in direct contradiction to AA's push for accountability. In fact, in recovery, we have a saying, you can't save everybody. The reality is you can't save anybody but yourself. But it kind of sounds like by asking God to do this, I don't have to fix my drinking, God does. And if he hasn't fixed it yet, he just hasn't decided to. So I can keep drinking, right? Now, my second problem here is with this idea of character defect. Now, the correct word to use here 99% of the time is trauma. And God can't remove that. Not just because it doesn't exist, but because it's a part of you. And you have to deal with it. You have to come to terms with it. One thing you see in treatment, people who are in treatment for the first time are finally facing the fact that they had a shitty childhood. Whew. Now, the Bible, well, let's go with Christians usually address trauma by saying God never gives us more than he thinks we can handle. Now, there's a skyrocketing suicide rate that would disagree with that. And again, in the 1930s, it didn't look like it was a treatable medical condition. But we don't live in the 1930s. We live in the 2020s, at least when I made this video. And we just plain know more about how this all works. So using character defects to treat addiction is like using the ether to broadcast radio waves. You might make it work, but it's not Wi-Fi, and we live in a Wi-Fi world. We can use actual science and medical technology here. We don't have to resort to character defects. Now, I'm not going to quote the next 3 steps. They deal with making the first round of amends, making amends. And there's not really a lot to talk about here, but the big conversation is forgiveness. And AA focuses a lot on seeking external forgiveness. Modern treatment focuses on forgiving yourself, forgiving those who have hurt you, and then considering whether or not and to what extent you should seek forgiveness. Now, if that sounds familiar, maybe it sounds like the Lord's Prayer, because the Lord's Prayer isn't completely wrong. The idea that we should forgive ourselves and we should forgive the people who hurt us, that's good. We all need to be doing that. We don't need God to do that. So the other thing I like to say about these steps is that they're also a place where if you're going to relapse, it's going to be when you go to make amends. And typically, you're supposed to write down all the things you did to hurt people. Maybe you go by a person and you say, Tarzan, I'm sorry I kept cutting the trees down while you were swinging through them. That was a dumb thing to do. Whatever. And then you're going to go to these people and you're going to make an apology, sort of. You're going to make amends. You're not necessarily going to make an apology, but it's subtly different. The difference is important. However, my point is, when you start to sit down and make that list, you're very much at risk for falling back into a cycle of rumination. And when you're ruminating, you're going to be drinking soon. And so this is how a lot of people on this step, making amends, wind up relapsing. A lot of times, the best move to make when you know you really hurt someone is to just let the relationship go. Maybe you can't fix it. Maybe you can try, but we often talk about how relapse is still in the future. It gets tricky. I'm of the belief that it's better to let someone you fucked over think you're an asshole than it is to relapse trying to fix things. Because at the end of the day, it's my recovery. Now, that said, I have already done my first round of making amends. So if you're watching this video and wondering why I haven't talked to you, I think you just learned something. These are also the steps that most people who aren't alcoholics are familiar with. And boy, will they throw it in our faces in the most manipulative ways possible. Of course, when you do that, you identify yourself as a toxic person that needs to be removed from my life. So feel free to attempt this at any time. All right, so here's step 11. Sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God, praying only for knowledge of his will for us and the power to carry that out. This is not ambiguous. You're trying to make conscious contact with God. And the rest of this step is taken just straight up out of the Bible. There is no room for defining your own higher power here. So again, if you have no God, this is useless. But AA says not to skip any steps. Now, this is common in evangelicalism. They'll give you 5 things for you to accept, and they're easy things to accept. 4 of them, perfectly fine, no problem. But the 5th one, you have to accept. They'll kind of slip God into there. And those other 4 depend on that 5th one to be true. So you have to accept God. It's also common in legal proceedings to get someone to admit to a small amount of guilt and then logically and inductively determine they're guilty for the whole thing. And cop shows use this all the time as a fun plot device. So if you have no God and you can't skip any steps, then what do? Do you find God or do you relapse? There has to be a better way than this. And then the last step, believe it or not, summarizes exactly what has made Christianity the historical and sometimes current terror that it has been. Having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to alcoholics and to practice these principles in all our affairs. Now, the motive here is good and solid. Find other alcoholics and help them. This has translated into modern treatment as what I like to call the service component of recovery. The service component of recovery isn't just about finding other alcoholics and helping them. It's about finding people who suffer from mental illness and helping them, and just finding people who need help and helping them. Just help people and don't be a dick. Now, we talk a lot about volunteering and like soup kitchens and food banks and stuff like that. But there's also the simple task of taking a customer service job. I work in a retail store where I get to use all those years of my mechanic experience to help people solve they're very real problems. So as much as I don't make a lot of money, I do actually really enjoy my job. So I don't want to throw away the motive here, but let's counter it with an idea from Buddhism. If you want good karmic fruit, you have to have both good intentions and good action. You don't need God or any sort of spiritual practice to be able to accept this idea. It simply states that if you want to do good, you have to both intend to do good and actually do good. Now, evangelism isn't inherently good or bad, but the way a lot of AA people practice it, it's definitely bad. The inspiration for me making this video was another series of conversations with people who believe in faith-based recovery, basically telling me I was wrong to try to start a secular, science-based recovery group. And those people are far more representative of the experiences I've had with AA than, anybody else. Also, whenever I talk about this in other meetings, a lot of people have had similar experiences. So AA doesn't get a bad rap for the God thing. It has earned its reputation for it. So those are the 12 steps. Now let's talk about the 12 traditions. And these are not just really important, but they kind of apply to other recovery groups. I'm not going to go through all 12 of the traditions because they mostly deal with remaining apolitical, staying focused on recovery, not organizing into a power-hungry organization and trying to take over the world, requiring individual groups to govern themselves, and protecting the privacy of members, and so on. Things you need in a recovery group. But there is one tradition that does matter here. The second tradition, which says, for our group purpose, there is but one ultimate authority, a loving God as he may express himself in our group conscience. Maybe you see the problem. There are two ways to interpret this. And what I really run into a lot is people equivocate on it. They want to use the first way, but they really believe the second way. So both ways to interpret this revolve around the phrase, as he may express himself. Now, one way to read this is that you are defining your own higher power. And so he may express himself however you've defined it. If your higher power is the bunnies that run through this field through here, then you also get to decide how they express themselves to you. And this is the kind of reasoning used to tell atheists that they can go to AA meetings. But the second way to read it is that this is the God as named. This is a capital God, and he will express himself only as he sees fit. So if you're not hearing him, you're doing it wrong. And I can't even tell you how many times I've heard someone from AA give me the first read, but actually believe the second one. So I guess this particular problem isn't really with AA itself. It's really more to do with members. But when you combine this attitude with the other traditions, you get a pretty toxic mixture of gaslighting and victim blaming. So the overall narrative of AA is that you've done all these things because you are a bad person, but you don't have to be a bad person. Here's some steps you can follow to be a good person, but only if you let God help you. And if that sounds familiar, that's because it mirrors the narrative of Christianity. You are a sinner. You will always be a sinner. You were born in sin, and the only way to redeem yourself is through the Lord Jesus Christ. It is worth pointing out that American courts have determined that AA is a religious organization. So if you get a DWI or DUI, whatever you want to call it, and you go to a judge, they can't order you to go to AA. They can order you to go to recovery meetings, but they can't specify AA. Besides all of these, I think, obvious problems with this Christian spirituality that's built into AA, and without which AA doesn't exist, I do have another serious problem with it, and this has to do with how outdated it is. Remember, it's like 100 years old. Alcoholics Anonymous encourages people to self-harm and keeps them in active addiction. I'll explain by talking about a friend of mine. Now, we have an on-again, off-again relationship. It's currently off. And what I'm about to talk about actually gets to the root of why both our friendship is currently off and why it's on again, off again in the first place. So this friend of mine, she'll say things like, I'm a bad friend. If you compliment her appearance, you look particularly nice today. She'll say something like, I'm glad you don't find me utterly repulsive. These are self-harming statements. I don't know if she cuts herself or anything like that. I do know that these statements, and many others like them that I've heard from her, are self-harming. And she's not the only person that I've heard talk like that. I've heard a lot of people talk like that. This is how people who self-harm tell you they self-harm without telling you. AA reinforces these kind of statements between telling you about your character defects, the exact nature of your wrongs, making amends, taking a moral inventory. AA rubs your nose in all the ways you're a bad person, thus encouraging you to continue believing you're a bad person. Then they tell you that you can only do better if you have a spiritual awakening. Does that sound familiar? Now, actual treatment starts when you say, I am a good person who has done some questionable and or bad things. It is true that if you want to do better, you have to start by admitting how you've done bad. And that's true. That's kind of basic. But the reality is, a bad person doesn't think they've done anything bad, and they won't admit it. They won't say it. They won't deal with it. If you have the motivation to do better and you want to be a better person, then you're already a good person, because a bad person just doesn't think like that. And then we get to the really difficult tradition. Personal recovery depends upon AA unity. And it's reasonable to read that as recovery isn't possible without AA. If that sounds a little monopolistic, just remember AA was the first group. There was nobody else around when they started. They probably didn't mean it that way. But this does bring us to the idea of a meeting junkie. Now, before you get all angry and start making comments about me calling someone a meeting junkie, I should remind you that when you're suffering a disease like substance use disorder, there tends to be a bit of gallows humor. So, for example, if someone asks me, what's your drug of choice? I'll say, oh, I'm a drunk. So, you might be hearing the word junkie and thinking that's a pejorative. Meeting junkie isn't a pejorative phrase. A meeting junkie is someone who replaces their drinking and using behaviors with going to meetings. That's all it is. So instead of drinking 7 days a week, they go to meetings. So obviously, if they miss a meeting, they're going to be very much at risk for drinking. And if you go into a rehab and you pull random people asking why they relapse, probably about a third of them will tell you, because I quit going to meetings. The truth is, recovery is actually possible without meetings at all. It is very difficult. Meetings give us a sense of community, belonging. There are people there that you can talk to about whatever you're going through, and they will understand, more than likely. They have better chances of understanding than just some rando on the street. Meetings provide accountability, so that if you drink, you go to a meeting and say, I drank, and people will be like, don't do that, maybe, but you don't have to go every day for this. In fact, the ideal frequency, well, it's different for, different people. There is a range of somewhere between once a week to about once a month. Anything less often than once a month, you get no benefit from the meeting. Anything more often than once a week, you should probably talk to your therapist and see if it's maybe too much. AA definitely helps some people. Through sheer brute force, they help thousands of people. They also keep thousands more in active addiction and tacitly encourage self-harm, even if those people are technically sober because they're not drinking. Now, I'm not going to AA. I will never go to AA. I have considered NA because they're a bit more modernized, but the reality is we just need more options. Now, smart recovery is a great option with one serious caveat. They reject the disease model of addiction. And this is because their treatment regimen is based on, or their meeting format is based on a common treatment regimen from the 80s, and they haven't updated it since then. They're good, and I definitely recommend you try them if you want a secular science-based meeting. They are national. You can find meetings in pretty much every major metropolitan area. But just remember that the science they use tends to be pretty outdated. Or maybe that was just the group I went to. I don't know. Then Refuge Recovery and Recovery Dharma. They're different, but they're the same. I'm not going to go into what's different about them. They are great Buddhist-inspired approaches. Now, Buddhism is spiritual, that is true, but it's not inherently incompatible with any other spiritual practice. I have personally facilitated meetings of both Refuge Recovery and Recovery Dharma. In fact, I was running a meeting during the changeover from one to the other. Then the pandemic shut down meetings, and these meetings haven't recovered, at least not in my area. The Life Ring is another great option because they're purely secular and science-based. The biggest problem here is that they're mostly in California. And the farther east you get and farther away from LA you get, the fewer and fewer meetings you're going to be able to find. They are not in every major metropolitan area, so maybe you should consider starting one. Now, if you know of any other meetings besides the ones I mentioned, make sure to link them in the comments. Make sure they're secular and science-based meetings, because that's what I want. I will delete if you link AA or NA or any of those. I will delete them. All right, so now we come to what I promised you at the beginning of the video. I have a concept for a new meeting format. It's actually a blend of the Refuge Recovery / Recovery Dharma meeting format, Life Ring meetings, and some actual therapy from when I was in rehab. Group therapy. So here's how I would structure a meeting. You would start with a boilerplate introduction where you say things like, this is a secular group, and we're not trying to be incompatible with any other group, and you give the name of the group. Then you do a check-in where you go around and ask everybody their name, how long they've been sober, and a fun fact about themselves, but you give a prompt for that, something silly like, if you were a superhero, which one would you be? If your life was a TV show, which show would best describe it? If you found a genie and he offered to turn you into an animal, which one would you pick? Something silly like that. Then after this, there would be a meditation, a guided meditation. 10 to 15 minutes. Then someone in the group would give a presentation. Now, this presentation would usually be probably something that came from a DBT manual. So we'll be talking, this is the part that comes from group therapy. So we'll be, doing like behavior chains and stuff like that, talking about grief and so forth. There can also be other topics, how to tell people at work that you're in a recovery, or how to deal with people who don't understand addiction and want to blame you for yours. Other topics that matter. And the reason this would be a presentation from someone in the group is so that as you get more involved in the group, you would become responsible for giving, a couple of presentations, and it would rotate every week, so that maybe throughout the course of 5 or 6 months, you would cover an entire DBT group. So it would be kind of a peer-led DBT. And of course, if you need actual therapist-led DBT, you need to go get that. So after this, we would do the talkie talk part, where everyone in the group would get 5 to 7 minutes to talk about basically anything. But the main topic would be, how was your week? That comes from LifeRing. They could also talk about whatever the topic in the presentation was, or anything that's really bothering them. This would also be the time when, if a person has drank since the last meeting, they would have to say so. Now, while you're talking, the group would watch for distorted thinking and try to intercept that. And then the person talking would have to stop and reframe what they're saying while focusing on facts rather than whatever distortions they're having. And so if you watch my What is Treatment video, I think I called this practicing effective communication. And then the meeting would end with a round of applause for everybody who's been sober this week. Then we would pass the hat and ask the group to help clean up the space and, make announcements, at the end of a meeting. Now, if I were going to start a recovery group, this is the format I would use. It's clean, it gives everybody a chance to talk about whatever they need to talk about, and it does provide some peer-led mental health treatment. And of course, if you have 20 people show up, we would need to split the group and just run 2 separate groups that night. And as always, if anybody in the meeting needs more intensive treatment, like something with a real therapist, then they need to go get that. But especially for anybody who's been in treatment recently, this format would provide a refresher for everything they did in treatment, and also group support for whatever they're going through. All right, so in conclusion, I'm not saying that we really need to get rid of 12-step programs. I'm saying that we need some new groups that need to be as big. Because when the first thought anybody has about being an alcoholic is that they're going to have to go to AA, that's a problem. So obviously we need more awareness of the other groups that already exist. I've linked in the description all of the non-12-step groups I've mentioned in this video. And again, if you know any others, please link them in the comments. And if you're in the Austin, Pflugerville, Round Rock area, and you're interested in the meeting format I've suggested, send me an email. When I get enough people, which is like 2, that will actually show up, then I am going to start this meeting. I'm still looking for a venue, but I am going to do this because I feel very strongly that this is a case of, if you want something done right, you have to do it yourself. But I am definitely tired of the idea that AA is the first line for recovery and the other groups only exist to help people who are already going to AA. We can do better. Thank you for watching the video. If you made it this far, you definitely need to like and subscribe. Ring the bell if you want to get notifications. And don't forget to join my Patreon. At some point, when people join my Patreon, this wall is going to be filled with names. Obviously, there aren't any right now. YouTube might be suggesting some videos here for you to watch. You could also do that. Have a nice day.